The G7 summit is set to begin on Monday in the French city of Evian on Lake Geneva. In neighboring Geneva, Switzerland, dozens of protest groups have joined demonstrations ahead of the elite summit to express their frustration about growing inequality, wars, failed climate politics, and U.S. policies under Donald Trump. The U.S. president is expected to attend the summit, which lasts until Wednesday. DW's Europe economic correspondent Sina joins me now from Geneva. Marie, what message do the protesters have for the G7 leaders?
Well, behind me, you can see the carcass of a Tesla car that was burnt down by protesters here not too long ago and was burning for about over an hour. And across from me is a bank that had its windows smashed in. So the general mood was slightly aggressive here, and a lot of the messaging was anti-capitalist. We saw caricatures of Donald Trump being carried around, caricatures of Elon Musk. But what also stood out is that there's not one clear message. It was kind of a potpourri of 60 different groups in total voicing their discontent. We saw a lot of Palestinian flags, Iranian flags, Lebanese flags, but also people dressed up as sunflowers and dancing, people with signs that were pro-gender equality. So different messaging. The one phrase everybody could agree on was "Tout le monde déteste le G7", so the whole world hates the G7.
I'm curious about something. Why has the Swiss city of Geneva been shut down for the G7, even though the summit's being held in France?
Well, yes, this is kind of counterintuitive, and it's also something that is on the minds of a lot of people from Geneva here. So Switzerland is not in the G7. Geneva is not actually hosting this summit, but it's the closest big international city to the summit. And so all the global leaders attending are landing here, and the protests are happening here. And we already saw this exact same situation back in 2003 when France hosted the G7 in Evian, and much of the city was actually destroyed in very violent protests and riots that year. And so a lot of the Genevans, and especially local business owners I've been speaking to, have said that they find it unfair that they are the ones bearing the brunt of this party that essentially Switzerland isn't even invited to.
We understand China and trade imbalances are supposed to be the big focus at this year's summit. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so trade imbalances is the euphemism that's being used in the program for the summit organized by French President Emmanuel Macron. What does it mean exactly? It means that the G7 nations at the summit are all suffering economically from one thing, and that is overcapacity on the side of China. So China is producing a lot more stuff than it actually uses, and it's exporting cheap electric vehicles, cheap batteries, cheap solar panels into the world, and that's harming economies around the globe, and especially also the G7 nations that are coming together. So one of the big aims of the French president is to find a solution to this imbalance, as he calls it. The big elephant in the room with this issue is that the big elephant isn't in the room. So China won't actually be at the G7 summit, but much of the discussions will be centered around problems that in the eyes of the G7 leaders are being caused by China.
So what measures are the leaders likely to discuss in response to the big elephant that's not in the room, China?
Well, that's another issue, the fact that the G7 nations actually have very different approaches when it comes to dealing with overcapacity and with this economic imbalance vis-à-vis China. The United States has been pro-decoupling, so basically shielding off its economy from collaboration, from influence from China, developing its own electric vehicles, its own technology, and a more aggressive approach. And that compares to the European Union, which is de-risking, as it calls. So it's not cutting off economic ties to China completely, but it wants to shield its economy from, for example, cheap electric vehicles flooding in. So slightly different approaches here, and again, missing the big elephant in the room, China. So the question is really what kind of joint understanding leaders will be able to come to in this very short time frame.
And this summit taking place against the backdrop, of course, of what's happening in the Middle East, which will surely be on the plate as well. That's DW's Sina in Geneva. Many thanks, Marie.